Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of All Things Policy. My name is Kripa Koshy, and I'm a staff program manager here at Takshashila, where I manage our postgraduate program in public policy. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by one of my colleagues to sort of unpack what might feel like a slightly complex, slightly convoluted sort of topic. But my hope is by having a chat with Amit today, it's going to unravel, I think, some of what might seem like a complicated topic to kind of understand. But the hope is that in our time today, we're going to look at the legal architecture of China's economic statecraft. But before we go into our subject matter here, I'd like to just take a moment to introduce Amit, who will be a familiar name to most of you if you've been following Takstashila's work. But Amit Kumar is a staff research analyst with Takstashila's Geostrategy Programme, and as well as a doctoral scholar at the Manipal Academy of Higher Studies. Amit closely monitors global geopolitical and geoeconomic trends. He does have a broader focus on China and studies issues typically at the intersection of economy, technology, security. But like I said earlier, in today's episode, he's going to help us unpack this very complicated web of regulations that underpins China's economic statecraft. So in particular, we're going to try and pay a little bit of attention to how Beijing has somewhat codified its ability to use economy as a bit of a lever for asserting or exerting some geopolitical power. We know, of course, just a quick glance at the headlines will tell us that a lot of geopolitical competition is heating up, especially when it comes to the race for some cutting edge tech. As a result, we know export controls are becoming a massive part of the conversation. So before I go further, I'm going to pause here and just say, welcome, Amit. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you. So as I was sort of saying, we're going to touch also, I think it's fairly salient that we're covering this because we are seeing in, of course, the news of the new US directive that's blocking foreign entities and individuals from accessing some of the world's most powerful and cutting edge sort of frontier level AI models. So it seems, right now there's this really fierce battle that's going on for global power, and it's bled almost into this world of artificial intelligence as well. So Amit, I wanted to actually pick your brain in particular on, maybe we'll start off with some of these new decrees that have been announced from the Chinese side, right? So you've been looking closely at some of this. So decrees 834, which I think looks at industrial and supply chain security, 835, which is countering unjustified extraterritorial jurisdiction. And then similarly, we also have another decree 837. So I think my question here is, the state council level of these new decrees, is this sort of a signal that it's not just temporal or temporary sort of coercion, but rather perhaps this permanent restructuring almost of how China is trying to engage with, or it's sort of signaling this new direction almost that China's heading in how it engages with the global economy?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kripa. Yes, so lately in the past 1 month or so, we have seen, as you said, China unveiling these three decrees, 834, which is on industrial supply chain, 835, that relates to countering extraterritorial jurisdiction of other countries when it comes, if that targets China, and then 837 on outbound investments, the kind of investments that China want to do or carry out in other parts of the world. So, again, we'll go back to what these, just to explain what these three decrees are and why we are talking about this. So, Decree 834, as I said, is about industrial supply chain and ensuring the security of Chinese industrial supply chains. And we'll go into the details later, but essentially the idea is if there are any measures undertaken by any other country which acts in an adversarial way, wherein they undertake such measures that in a way harms China's industrial supply chain or tries to undercut China's dominance in the global supply chain, the global value chain, there will be consequences, right? And China will not. And this is largely, we'll talk about it later in the later part of the episode, but largely relating to the anxiety with respect to countries trying to de-risk from China, given the dependence, right? So if there are any attempts towards that, right, there'll be some consequences, and those consequences will be in the form of export controls on goods, export controls on certain kind of technologies, export control, prohibitions and restrictions on travel, etc. Right, and the way companies from adversarial countries can invest in China, and the kind of things that can do cannot do. Right, so these are the kind of things. If they deem that there's an action that is harming their industrial supply chain in the larger global value chain, there will be some consequences. Then comes the Decree 835, which relates to extraterritorial jurisdiction. So imagine, I mean, we're already aware of the extensive list that US maintains of unreliable entity list, or so if a company is sanctioned or listed under US's entity list, so they'll and secondary sanctions could kick in if a company from or a enterprise from any other country, or even a Chinese enterprise, has a business relationship with that listed company in the entity list. Yeah, so the next is Decree 835. It largely relates to countering extraterritorial jurisdictions. So suppose now there's a country, in this case, imagine US, and US maintains an extensive list of entity lists, right? And there are certain repercussions if you have business relations or market relations with an entity that is listed in US's entity list, right? So there'll be secondary sanctions that will kick in if you have certain business relationship with those listed in the entity list, and therefore, and most these which are listed in entity list happen to be a Chinese enterprise, right? So Huawei was one at one point of time, and certain companies or enterprises which have military relations with the PLA, Chinese PLA. So those would be listed, and therefore it becomes difficult for enterprises around the world, or even Chinese enterprises, to work with them, right? And therefore those sanctions would kick in. So now what they're trying to do is, the Chinese are trying to say, if you comply with those sanctions, there'll be consequences now for you within, if you have market presence within China. And even if you don't have market presence, because the supply chain, the global supply chain, is so heavily integrated with the Chinese industrial supply chain, they'll find out some way or the other. They'll catch you, and you'll have repercussions. So it will not go unnoticed and unpunished, right? And the third is Decree 837. Decree 837 is about regulating outbound investments from China. Now, there have been a lot of talk about why the kind of, I mean, because China maintains a huge trade surplus, one way to counter is if China allows investments and should vacate some of the sectors in the global value chain, lower end, where you have lower end manufacturing, etc., right? And should allow other countries to grow. It's essentially a flying geese model, where as a country progresses and becomes richer and richer, it vacates lower end manufacturing value chain, the lower end manufacturing segments, and occupies upper end manufacturing segments, right? But in China's case, that has not been happening. China has been anxious, and again, we will go into the detail why it is happening. But China wants to regulate and prohibit and restrict certain kinds of investments. It does not want companies to be taking that decision. That decision has now become strategic. While earlier it used to be a business decision for the companies, whether they want to invest in the country, whether do they see that expansion in, I mean, let's go back to 1970s, 80s, and 90s, when US enterprises or the Western enterprises saw that the labor costs, input costs, etc., were rising. What they did was, they had to, I mean, they had no other way but to, diversify and have plants either in Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, and even China, Malaysia, and then later came Malaysia, Singapore, etc. So they had to do it just because it made strategic business sense to do it. Otherwise, uh, the cost of manufacturing in those the Western hemisphere did not just make sense. And again, as a country becomes richer, those compulsions or those considerations become key, and therefore you would also see enterprises, as they become richer and richer in China, and labor and put costs get higher, you would see companies, relocating to other places. But this is not something which China wants. Now, with that, in the hindsight, why is China trying to do this? So we need to put this in the larger context of 2 to 3 developments. One, in the past 5 or 6 years, the geopolitical contestation between the US and China has intensified to a next level. And there has been an effort, even, and because China is a rising power, right, challenging a status quo power, which in this case is the US. There are, this time when Xi and Trump met, Xi in Beijing earlier this last month, in fact, there was a term that was used, Thucydides trap, right, which is when there is a status quo power and there is a revisionist power, the expanding interest of a revisionist power, which is China in this case, continuously infringes upon existing interests of status quo power, and there will be frictions, right, and that becomes a vicious cycle, and they both get trapped into this vicious cycle, which is denoted by the term Thucydides trap, and therefore there are constant frictions and tensions. And Xi Jinping warned essentially Trump that you do not fall into this trap. You have your interest, I have my interest. We should not have conflicting interests, and blah blah blah. Anyway, so this is what has been happening, and US has tried to constrain for right strategic reasons China's progress. And I said in the intro, nowhere is this being fiercely fought than the domain of AI, as we saw US issuing a directive to Anthropic to suspend all access to Mythos 5 and Fable 5 to all foreign nationals. Only the Americans can use it. Even though you're a foreign national employee with Anthropic, you are not allowed to have an access to those LLMs, right? So that's quite bizarre. I mean, being an Anthropic employee, yet not being able to use it's one of the most advanced LLMs, right? So that's the kind of fear, and therefore they're trying to master certain segments of technology, etc. So these are background in against which this has been happening, and in response, what China started doing was since 2015. Again, its consideration of national security also started to evolve from purely defense and security focused issues. For the very first time in 2015, with the inception of national security law, the scope of national security was expanded to domains of culture, technology, and economy and society, right? So it's a comprehensive national security approach that they have started taking. And therefore, the approach towards economy is just not development but that of security. So that's developmental security concept of economy, and therefore you see that was the time when they started working on these legislation, foundational legislation, and then the decades, just to an extensive list of legal architecture that they've been trying to build. Because if you look at US has had a history of having this extensive list of economic legislation around economic statecraft. The two most important one would be, as I mentioned earlier, entity list and section 301 of the Trade Relations Act, which so entity list we are already aware, but section 301 is where unjustified, unverified, if US deems fit that there are certain trade actions are being undertaken by its trade partner which is unjust, unfair, or is hurting market in any way, or even there are strategic reasons, it can investigate those matters and impose sanctions. And again, China happens to be on the receiving end of this tool, right? So there are certain things that US itself has been doing, and therefore there have been frictions.
And so there's opportunity.
And this is what China's response
to respond, yeah.
Counter that response.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I was just, touching on one of the points you mentioned of, sort of this key idea of a little bit of scope creep, right? That when we start thinking of introducing sort of a security element and angle to domains or sectors that have been largely agnostic to security concerns in a way. So, an example that I think we had discussed in the past was, the export control law, let's say in 2020, as well as these new decrees where I think you touched on briefly to say that, there is an element of state control that's now permeating into these domains, that it's not being left up to businesses alone to actually determine how they engage. But do you see there's, that's part of the motivating factors also to build a bit of a legal legitimacy for a lot of this retaliation, to do so almost like to reverse engineer and to find some sort of legal backing for justifying some of these interventions, for putting sort of these foundational building blocks even going forward, so that this can actually mark as a change sort of in how the Chinese state sort of engages with the world at large?
Yeah, of course. There's an element of providing legal sanction to these instruments. So earlier, just picking up on what you mentioned with regards to export control law. So until 2020, export control law, the China's export control law largely catered to things like unfair or unwarranted flow of goods when it came to nuclear proliferation, chemical warfare, biological weapons, etc. Things that world as one would be, concerned about, right? Things like those. So where there was a heavy consensus that these are things that you need to, strictly control when it comes to exports or imports of certain goods, certain kinds of goods, right? But in 2020, for the very first time, what the Chinese did was that they expanded the scope of export controls to even include such instances or use export controls as an instrument in such instances where they might think that there has been an adversarial intent by a
Wow.
trading partner,
Mhm.
and or they offer strategic use even if there is no adversarial intent, but they want to have a strategic they believe that it is in their strategic interest to impose certain forms and kinds of export controls. They would not shy away from deploying them, right? So one key example was critical minerals. Now, critical minerals is not something which would come under the domain of export controls in its traditional sense, right?
Mhm, mhm.
Uh, they would be largely nuclear, as I mentioned, nuclear, biochemicals, etc., right? But they thought that if their dominance on a certain segment of the industry is strategic, is in their strategic interest, it just makes strategic sense to impose export controls in a way that no other either partner, adversary, ally, whatever, gains or undercuts China's dominance in that sector. So the scope of export controls itself was enlarged. Now, coming on to the question whether this is just for providing legal sanction, I think there's more to it. Yes, of course, you need a legal instrument, a legal sanction. Otherwise, it'll be difficult to convey to your businesses and even to your state departments as to how to go about it, right? So you need certain rules, regulation, decrees,
Some
notifications,
infrastructure in this way. Yeah. Yeah.
plan of action
Mm.
as to when particular export control or particular instrument of economic statecraft kicks in. What are the
Mm.
conditions? What
Mm.
are the triggers, etc. So the information needs to flow, and there needs to be a sort of some sort of clarity over when this will kick in. So yeah,
Right.
that's that component to it. But then again, uh, there are two other things that have led China to respond in this manner. So again, both the reasons emanate from China itself, and those two factors would be China's industrial overcapacity and willingness to resort to economic coercion.
Hmm.
Now, overcapacity is a long-standing concern with regards to Chinese economy, and for a long, long time, developing countries and India especially have been at the receiving end of this, and they have been making noises about this, but to nothing came out of it, right? To no effect. But what has happened in the past 5 6 years is that China's industrial overcapacity obviously means China's trade surpluses are expanding, and for the very first time, I think for the last 2 years, the China's trade surplus stood at more than $1 trillion, right? So that was huge. No other country in the ever in the history of has had this huge a trade surplus. And the problem is that this trade surplus is not had just not come in the domains of low quality products or cheap products, but high tech goods and manufacturing goods as well, merchandise goods as well. And this time around, even countries like the forebearers of the flag bearers of liberal economic architecture, they have been at the receiving end, like the US, EU, Germany, Netherlands. So the harbingers of free trade and these countries, they have been at the receiving end. And now the opposition has started to come from these sections of the society and the economic world. Now, because they have heft which is much greater than those of the developing countries, this has started to become an issue for the Chinese, and they are actually in some form of position to counter China's industrial overcapacity and dumping. So there's a lot of pressure if you look at constantly read what is happening between the US and the Chinese and the EU and the Chinese. You would say that trade has become a very sticking point in their relationship. We would remember Trump's first term. 2018 was when the trade war started, and the idea was that we will decouple from China because China exports too much, imports nothing, and the trade deficit is too much, and China just does not believe in addressing those issues. And there are structural issues within the Chinese economy which it needs to sort out. to help this to address this issue, but that is not happening. But again, the idea of decoupling did not take effect, or was not very was not something which countries agreed to, because China today controls about 35% of the global manufacturing output, both by value and
Right. The dependence is too significant to say that we'd like to alienate you from the conversation completely.
yeah. So the problem is that because China dominates the global manufacturing output, and to the tune of 30 to 35%, you can't just decouple it, right? But again, the concern remained, right? Because the concern was that you are overly dependent on China. So one, it is what it is doing is what it is deindustrializing your country. Now, today, German automobile sector, one of the most advanced sectors, it is at the receiving end of this EV boom that has happened in China, and has replaced. And German automakers, Japanese automakers are having a tough time selling their products both inside China, and again facing stiff competition in Europe and other Southeast Asian markets. And this is where the concern is coming from. So earlier, the concern emanated from developing countries, but there was nothing that you could do, right? But today, there are countries that are impacted, are the likes who can actually do something about it. And therefore, the idea of de-risking evolved. So you need to de-risk from the Chinese market. And the second thing was that because this over-dependence on China, because you depend on China, it offers China a huge strategic leverage to arm twist you. And that China has shown, right? In the past, it has done that against Japan. Started with the 2010 incident of China imposing rare earth bans, export bans on Japan, right? And Japan at that point of time depended on China for about 90% of its supplies. And that was that was largely over a issue of because the Japanese coast guards had detained some of the Chinese fishermen who were entering into Japanese territory. But because it did that, China responded with export controls, and eventually the Japanese had to release them because it was too much of for them to handle, right? So those are the kind of things that Chinese have done. And with the last few years, again, with respect to India, if you see, there were tunnel boring machines, fertilizers, rare earths, semiconductor equipments, even flow of talent, Foxconn employees that was supposed to come to India to train the Indian workforce. There was a prohibition and restriction on their movement as well. So China has been trying to do that. So largely, there is twofold concern that has emanated out of China's dominance, largely in the global economy or the global industrial landscape. One, that it is flooding the market with cheap products. It may not be bad quality products, but again, being traded at much lower price than the market price, which is deindustrializing country, now also happening in these advanced economies. The second is this particular thing offers China a strategic leverage to do something about it. And therefore, you now see that there's a counter measure that is being, and there are, so very recently, there was a non-white paper that was leaked from the EU Commission. They are supposed to have their meeting soon, wherein they talked about penalizing their own companies and own sectors if they find out that their supply chain is concentrated beyond a particular threshold in one region, right? And largely, they did not name
Oversaturated.
China. Yes,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
inadvertently naming China. But yeah, so because companies and businesses have very varied interests, they're largely driven by profits. And
Yeah.
if profits come by, they did not mind in having concentrated supply chains. So things like these. And the other thing that they talked about was because these investigations, every time an investigation is undertaken against the Chinese companies, it might take about 18 to 20 months, 24 months, for the results to come out. And by then they have, because there is no halt on trade or something, by then they have already, deindustrialized a complete sector, and you have nothing to then play with, right? So there was talk about that under this new regulation, things will kick in uh, immediately after a concern is raised, and trade will be paused in those sectors. And then uh, when it comes to imposing restrictions on Chinese companies, they would not do it at a firm level, but at a very uh, top level, in the sense that if there's so that it uh, does not allow a Chinese enterprises to have their subsidiaries to reroute some of the products, right? So if there is a subsidiary of let's say Huawei which is trading with a European company, and that has come under scanner, and that is flouting the comparative advantage principle of trade. What they would do is not just sanction that particular entity, but the uh, the company that holds stake in that company, so that there is no uh, room for circumventing this rule, right? So things like this. So, and the Chinese have been noting this for quite some time, and therefore you see that these laws and regulations, they have been perfecting them. They have still not implemented them in at scale, but this is what the logic is right now.
Yeah, I mean, seems like a fairly sophisticated enterprise and operation that, like you sort of, I think, really excellently laid out, has been spanning over, multiple years. Like this has been a machinery in motion for a while. I think one thing I was curious about and hope to sort of double click on with you was, with some of these new regulations or new supply chain regulations in particular, there is this little bit of a catch-22, right? So if you could elaborate on that. So, in instances where a company complies with, let's say, a US or EU sanction, they are now running the risk of breaking, Chinese law. And if they don't comply, then of course they risk sort of losing their Western market in some way if they don't follow along with some of these. So this bit of this compliance trap that's sort of been set up, is that just supposed to be accepted as the inevitable way forward now for a global firm trying to do business in China? That this is sort of what the new sort of status quo is going to be?
Yeah. So yes, at the moment it looks like it's more of a political signaling than something that the Chinese would want to implement right away. So you haven't seen a lot of instances where China has imposed, even though some of the foundational laws existed and they could have done something. You haven't seen them. I mean, especially with respect to counter jurisdictional thing, right? But yes, so see, there are two reasons why the Chinese have done that. So there's a bit of anxiety among the Chinese that now that, as I was saying in my previous answer, that now that there is a consensus that has emerged, even though ever since Trump has come to power, he has done everything in his power to dismantle that concern by going against US's allies, partners, and adversaries alike. And most of the concessions that eventually were given were, did not benefit any of the US's allies and partners, right? It would have been another matter if Trump had gone after China, but instead he chose to go after each one of his partners and allies. So that has dismantled some form of consensus which was emerging with regards to tackling China's overcapacity problem and the coercion problem. But again, nevertheless, that consensus still holds. It will be, it was kicked down the road, but it will still be there. So, and China is really anxious that some of these things could actually materialize, if not today, maybe in the coming future, right? And that might, and China regards and wants to have, even if you look at the 15th five-year plan, the latest plan that was released in March this year, they have a very specific mandate that the manufacturing share of the GDP has to be at about, I mean, they did not mention the numbers, but at this point of time, it's about 25% of the GDP is contributed by manufacturing, and it has to be stable. So they want to retain that thing. And second, they do not. What they also say is that they do not want to vacate traditional industries, uh, emerging industries, strategic industries, industries of future. They want to have it. They want to have a presence, a dominating presence across all sectors, all industries, and that would require you to sustain and maintain the existing advantages, right? But if these things materialize, right? If you are, let's say, complying, if there are other companies and if US continues to issue certain directives like it did with respect to the EUVs, right? So there was a trilateral uh, partnership that was a deal that was concluded in 2023, wherein Japan, Netherlands, and US came together to control the supply of photolithography tools and contain that its production within these three countries alone. And because those are very crucial in designing chips and manufacturing chips at large scale, advanced chips, right? Because again, as we discussed, AI is going to be the domain where this will be fiercely fought. This battle will be fiercely fought. So what they did is that they imposed this restriction, and now as a result, Chinese do not have access to the most advanced photolithography tools, and because of that, they're really struggling. And then Huawei is also sanctioned. and then therefore their chip manufacturing capability, and then kind of it is trailing behind the American capacity by about a year or so. And then the idea is that it would halt even their progress in AI, right? So the Chinese are concerned that if these kind of things, so this is clearly an extra jurisdictional territorial kind of an order which every other country now has to comply with. The Japanese have to comply with, the Netherlands have to comply with, the Dutch have to comply with, right? So if these kind of things materialize, there's an existential fear among the Chinese that they might lose advantage in certain segments. If these kind of spill over to other domains of
Right.
manufacturing, they will have certain disadvantages, and they do not want that, right? Yeah. So because of that existential question, whether if these things or these kind of instruments begin to materialize, even though it seems fractured, the consensus seems fractured for now. If it comes back after Trump leaves, or if this materializes in the coming years, this would pose an existential threat and a question to the Chinese dominance in this economic landscape. And this is one leverage that they hold against the let's say it works as an insurance against Western dominance of financial architecture. So they have got, I mean, they can block you whenever they want because of the world's dependence on dollar, on Swift, etc., right? And they're very vulnerable, and this is what we have seen already play out with respect to China-Russia trade relations, right? They suddenly boomed after Russia invaded Ukraine, and and within 2 years they managed to double their trade. And but when the secondary sanctions kicked in, the Chinese companies found it very difficult to deal with the Russian companies, and therefore for 8 months there was no settlement of trade, and therefore it had a very adverse impact on the bilateral trade between China and Russia, and therefore we saw in the last year, I mean, the trade declined as opposed to increasing, which was increasing in the past 2 years. So they have already felt that, and they do believe that because the world's dependence on the Western financial architecture, this is one of their insurance and their leverage against this thing, and they would like to maintain it, as I've already said, was mentioned and reiterated in their 15th five-year plan. They're striving to maintain that dominance, and therefore these kind of questions coming on to whether they will implement it. I think this is just at a stage of political signaling, just to tell the companies that, see, now we have legal instruments, now you will be subject to these kind of things if you try to be act smart and comply with those uh, regulations. And therefore it's also a signal to both the businesses and then them to lobby against the American state, the US state, that beware when you put one of the Chinese companies in the entity list, or bar them from having a presence in China, or restrict Chinese investments overseas, right?
Yeah, I think it's a fairly sort of take around some of these considerations, and I think it's helping sort of understand some of the complexities actually at play with some of this, to sort of see and really makes it an exciting space to watch, actually, to sort of understand now what is a possible way forward, as we have a lot of these global powers who are jostling for relevance, significance, ownership of a lot of this sort of public space. And so I think, in the interest of time, we're going to maybe conclude our conversation here. But I do know this is an area that you are going to continue doing a little bit more research on. And I think just well-deserved sort of spotlight on some of the considerations of understanding China's economic statecraft, some of the features of it. I know that you've painstakingly looked at how some of this legal foundation has been set up, and keeps it, I think, really exciting for us to sort of watch and see how this space develops and shifts almost in real time. I imagine even as this episode comes out, there's going to be something new that'll come and hit the newspaper the next day. So, but thank you so much for your time, Amit. This was incredibly insightful. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kripa.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.